This American election result has completely upset the view most Christians have of how prophecy will be fulfilled. Many thought the deal of the century was going to be the covenant with the many. Well, certainly not if Biden wins. So how does a Biden presidency impact our understanding of prophecy? Like Israel, Iran, covenant with the many. That's what we're talking about today, and we're starting right now. Biden has been declared president, and although Trump will contest it, we're not focusing on the Trump angle. Rather, we're looking at the critical issues we just mentioned, since it is very likely that Biden will become the next president. In our last video, we discussed how the church doesn't have time to wait to prepare. We need to consider these things right now. We can always drop this discussion if God works a miracle and Trump emerges victorious, but this video is on the prophetic impact of a Biden presidency. First of all, a Biden presidency affects the way people view who is going to be the Antichrist. There's an enormous group in this community and elsewhere who have envisioned Trump as the Antichrist. I imagine there are some, like there are still some who think Obama will be the Antichrist, who will continue to view him that way. But obviously, if he loses, for most of us, that idea is a thing of the past. So, to those of you who felt the Antichrist was going to be Trump, or even Jared Kushner, I invite you to rethink your ideas. Maybe lots of your ideas on the end times, because many more critical questions revolve around Israel, Iran, the rest of the Middle East. What happens with the deal of the century? What happens with the Abraham Accords? And of course, all of these affect our view of prophecy. I know. You think you have it all figured out, and God throws us a curve. Yes, it's God who throws us a curve. God chooses our leaders and kings. This election result may have taken many Christians by surprise, but it certainly didn't take God by surprise. He permitted it. And if Biden was his choice, this administration will fit into the biblical prophecies just as God imagined, just not the way many Christians had imagined. Now, we are instructed to watch over 30 times in the New Testament, and this is exactly what that means, to keep our eyes on world events and see how they might be fulfilling biblical prophecy. And we need to pivot and change our minds when we see God doing something new. God's view of prophecy is what counts, not our previous views. Let's begin by looking at the issue of Israel and the deal of the century. Obviously, this was the brainchild of the Trump administration and Jared Kushner in particular. With them gone, there is next to no chance that deal will be resurrected. And there is even less chance that the current plan can be implemented in Trump's remaining last 2 months in office. The Palestinians did not like it. Now, with a new American president calling the shots in Washington, why would they sign a deal they don't like? It won't happen unless Trump wins in some kind of miracle recount finish. How does this impact the covenant with the many? A vast number of Christians have been imagining that the Trump deal of the century was that covenant. Well, barring a miracle, it won't be. It's dead in the water. So for everyone thinking the deal of the century was the covenant, it's time to go back to square one. And we'll look at that more a little bit later. But what about the American embassy in Jerusalem? Will it be moved back to Tel Aviv now Biden is president? Well, maybe, but probably it will be in relation to a negotiated two-state solution. And that solution will likely now be negotiated by someone hostile to Israel as opposed to someone favorable to Israel. But since it has to start at square one, we don't anticipate those negotiations to start anytime soon. What will be the false peace that the Bible speaks of? Could it be the Abraham Accords that President Trump started but now have a life of their own? Well, granted, a big portion of why many of the southern Arab nations signed that agreement was that the USA was likely offering to continue to support them if they signed and maybe withdraw support if they didn't. Now that Trump is gone, there will be no support for a Trump legacy program from Biden, but this program has advantages for the southern tier Arab states without any USA sweeteners. Obviously, these nations are banding together for mutual protection and mutual economic benefits. A major reason the Accords came into being was protection from Iran. And with Biden in the Oval Office, the Iran nuclear deal will likely resurrect. And Iran will become richer and more dangerous. So I totally expect the Abraham Accords to continue for the time being and even expand to other nations. We need to keep our eyes on this. This agreement may be much more prophetically important than many have thought initially. Now, one of our very astute community members pointed out to me that it looks like Trump assembled the king of the South nations through the Abraham Accords. And maybe Biden will be the president to help assemble the king of the North nations in Daniel 11 and Ezekiel 38. Certainly a frightening but realistic thought. The deal of a century and the Abraham Accord were Trump's main Middle Eastern initiatives. But what about Israel itself? As we stated in our previous video, it is prophetically necessary that the USA policy toward Israel change. That is why I wasn't at all surprised that Trump lost in this election. Not for political reasons, but for prophetic ones. I was expecting it. In fact, look at these two men on the screen. Neither one will be in power in a year. Imagine the Middle East without them. That is the future. The Bible tells us in multiple places that in the end times, Israel will be abandoned and isolated and then invaded by forces of the Antichrist at the midpoint of the 70th week of Daniel. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are the days of punishment, so that all things that have been written will be fulfilled. Woe to those women who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. If Israel was invaded in this way under a Trump presidency, the USA would rush to their aid. However, it is very likely in a Biden administration that it will mirror the Obama administration's attitude toward Israel. Biden may provide some support, but it is highly unlikely he would involve the USA in World War III in order to protect Israel. It will almost certainly be a let them fend for themselves kind of attitude for the next 4 years. And that change in attitude of the USA toward Israel was absolutely necessary for a future invasion of Israel to take place. That is why this election was a timepiece for me personally of where we were on God's prophetic clock. If Trump won, my guess was that we would have at least 4 years until an invasion of Israel could take place. However, now that Trump is gone, all bets are off regarding where we are on God's timetable. We could even be in the midst of the 70th week of Daniel itself right now. Members of this community certainly think so. Me, I'm not so sure. I kind of doubt it. But the bottom line is, the USA is no longer a hindrance to that invasion taking place. A major restraint has been removed, allowing prophecy to move forward, possibly at lightning speed. I do not think the USA is the restrainer, but they certainly were a factor in holding back the Antichrist invasion. Now that invasion will come from the north. So let's begin to examine how a Biden presidency might assemble the king of the north countries. As we mentioned previously, a big part of that is Iran. Biden has signaled he'll seek to bring Iran back into the 2015 nuclear accord the USA brokered when he was vice president under Obama. That means the economic sanctions President Donald Trump imposed on Iran and just tightened this fall could be erased. If so, this will dramatically impact Iran's financial position. Iran is one of the major oil producers in the whole world, capable of, 3.5 million barrels a day. And Iran becoming wealthy once the nuclear accord is back in play has dramatic prophetic impacts that most Christians don't realize. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will stir up the entire empire against the realm of Greece, which is actually Yavon in the Hebrew. Most Christians read right over this verse and imagine this is speaking of ancient Persia. However, what they miss is that ancient Persia had a dozen more kings prior to Alexander the Great. This verse says it was only 4 more. So there is a discrepancy that no scholar that I know has ever adequately addressed. In fact, based on this verse, the ancient Jews in the 2nd century cut 200 years out of their calendar, saying there were only 4 more kings between Cyrus and Alexander. We now know by archaeological means that there were in fact a dozen kings, as we just said, and the 2nd century Jews were wrong. So why does this verse say only 4 then? What's with that? Is the Bible mistaken? No, obviously not. It is entirely likely and probable, rather, that this verse is primarily a future fulfillment, and that this verse is speaking of modern-day Iran when it mentions Persia. And notice, it mentions riches of a 4th king becoming rich. Is that because of the Iran deal? Maybe. Let's consider the possibilities. So who might be these kings? Since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, there have been 2 supreme leaders or ayatollahs. But the current ayatollah is in his 80s and terminally ill with cancer. A 3rd ayatollah is imminent. But the prophecy says it is the 4th king whose riches surpass them all. Is the 3rd ayatollah just going to be some kind of short-term ruler? Well, maybe, but more likely in my mind, a 2nd ruler is added to the government, one who rules alongside the Ayatollah, but surpasses him in power. That's what the Bible tells us. So who could that be? Then I raised my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram, which had 2 horns, was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but the one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. The ram is Persia, and the 2 horns are the 2 kings who reign simultaneously. This is another passage that has been ascribed 100% to ancient Persia and also Alexander the Great, despite the fact that the angel Gabriel in this passage tells Daniel 3 times it applied to the end times. So if you still hold the traditional view, I suggest you watch this video and this video, whose links are down in the description. These videos examine a dozen reasons Daniel 8 cannot be only about Alexander the Great. However, for our purposes today, we're assuming our view is correct, and Daniel 8 is talking about Iran as the ram, and that it will one day have two rulers, the second of which comes up after the first and becomes more powerful and richer. Now, if it is Iran, then the first horn or king has to be the Ayatollah. But who is this second horn or king who becomes more powerful? Some think it's a military leader. Others, like me, believe it may be a false messiah, Shia Islam's 12th Imam. The only person who it makes sense in my mind could easily supplant the Ayatollah as supreme. But either way, Scripture tells us that this fourth king becomes richer than them all, and a Biden presidency might facilitate this by lifting the sanctions. And of course, renewal of the nuclear deal will pave the way for Iran to become a nuclear power. That will be scary not only for Israel, but for Iran's Islamic neighbors as well. This will be the driver, I believe, for Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords, and all the nations in that group to form a mutual protection pact. As we discussed in this previous video, that group will become the King of the South, mentioned in Daniel 11. At least that's our opinion. But a nuclear Iran will not only scare countries to the south of it, but likely Turkey and their pseudo-dictator Erdogan, who, of course, wants to be a caliph of all of Islam. How might he react to a newly rich and powerful Iran? We know from Ezekiel 38 that Iran one day will be subservient to this guy named Gog, who will be the leader of Turkey in those days. How does that happen? How does Iran become the servant of a Sunni Muslim Turk? Daniel 8 tells us again, Yevan, which is based in western Turkey, invades Persia, which is Iran. Behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a prominent horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him with mighty wrath. And I saw him come up beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. And he struck the ram and smashed his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat made himself exceedingly great. The goat, which is likely a revived caliphate based in Turkey, flies over the surface of the earth. Is this a missile attack? Possibly a preemptive strike before Iran becomes nuclear. We don't know. But I think that's what it is. Either way, Turkey crushes Iran. But how does Biden figure into this scenario? My guess is that Biden's presidency won't last all 4 years, due to his health or maybe his mental health. And Kamala Harris will be president at that time, succeeding Biden. How would she respond to an Islamic caliphate taking out Iran, maybe with nuclear weapons? We have no way of knowing, but based on what I've seen of her so far, she would be petrified and unable to act. So the goat, the caliphate, would have its way. The pieces just seem to keep falling into place. And in that way, the Biden-Harris administration would be the facilitators of the King of the North, just as Trump had been with the King of the South. And all the players will be in place for the Antichrist to come on the scene. But that will be another video. Instead, right now, let's return to the issue of the covenant with the many. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, the deal of the century is dead in the water. And the false peace, which the Old Testament prophets predicted, will have to come another way. I want you all to imagine that this false peace that ensnares Israel may not come the way you've been imagining it. Let's see what the prophets say. Behold, the prophets are telling them, You will not see a sword, nor will you have famine. On the contrary, I will give you lasting peace in this place. Then the Lord said to me, the prophets are prophesying falsehood in my name. I have neither sent them, nor commanded them, nor spoken to them. They are prophesying to you a false vision. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have made a pact. The gushing flood will not reach us when it passes by, because we have made falsehood our refuge, and we have concealed ourselves with deception. So there will definitely be a false peace. But look at how it's organized. Woe to the rebellious children, declares the Lord, who execute a plan, but not mine, and make an alliance, but not of my spirit, in order to add sin to sin, who proceed down to Egypt without consulting me, to take refuge in the safety of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. So, Israel is going to seek safety, but it looks like that safety is in Egypt. They seek it in an alliance. Is this the Abraham Accord? Will Egypt join, and is it part of the king of the south in whom Israel seeks shelter now that they won't have the USA? I think if this election has taught us anything, it is that what you thought and what I thought was happening might not be what it is. Let's consider the covenant with the many. It might not be the peace deal that we have been thinking it is. I certainly don't believe it is. And he will confirm a covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, gushes forth on the one who makes desolate. This is the only verse in Scripture that seems to support the idea that the Antichrist is the one who makes a peace deal. And it doesn't really say that, does it? It only says an unnamed he confirms or strengthens the covenant. Think about that. And when Jesus gave us the signs of the end in Matthew 24, he said nothing about a peace deal being part of those signs. And when Paul wrote and explained how the Antichrist will be revealed, he said nothing about a peace deal or a covenant. He said the Antichrist will be revealed by sitting in the holy place of God and declaring himself God. It's my opinion that you should be very careful in looking for a covenant with the Antichrist. Daniel 9:27 might be interpreted incorrectly by the vast majority of scholars. And what about the church? How will a Biden presidency affect the church? Will there be increased persecution? Will there be an accelerated falling away? Will the church even have to go underground? Click right here to keep watching the Biden trilogy and learn how this president in particular will separate the sheep from the goats in our pews today. And if you want to see how the New World Order may have just taken over America, well, click right here to see the first installment. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.